This podcast is an initiative by ENRICH in Brazil and Confap, highlighting mutual priorities and challenges between the European Union and Brazil on issues such as research, development, and innovation. This episode of the ENRICH Innovation Station podcast is available on Spotify and YouTube. Visit confap.org.br and stay tuned of the main research, development, and innovation highlights between Brazil and the European Union, an ENRICH in Brazil and Confap initiative. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our podcast, a new podcast of the ENRICH Innovation Station, an initiative of the ENRICH in Brazil and the Brazilian National Council of State Funding Agencies, Confap, with the objective to highlight multiple priorities and challenges for the European Union and Brazil in research and innovation. I'm Carlo Cauti. I'm president of the Association of Foreign Correspondents in Brazil, and I have the pleasure and the honor for presenting this podcast. Today, we will talk about a very interesting topic, and I can say a very current as well topic in order what we are looking around us in the planet. We'll talk about the role of science diplomacy in fostering international cooperation and research and innovation, focusing on talking about ocean science diplomacy. And in order to talk about this very interesting topic, we have with us Mr. Sam Robinson, is case study author on the Insight Project, teaching associate of the Department of History and Philosophy of Science of University of Cambridge. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
And also we have Mr. Andrei Polejack, Senior Advisor of Minister of Science, Technology and Innovation of Brazil, PhD candidate of World Maritime University in Sweden. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
So let's talk about a science diplomacy landscape, focusing, of course, on ocean science diplomacy in Europe and in Brazil. Let's try to highlight some success cases, examples, and what science diplomacy, specifically ocean science diplomacy, can do in order to foster international relations between Brussels and Brasilia. So I would like to start the first question to Mr. Sam Robinson. I want to talk about how science diplomacy, how ocean science diplomacy can foster international relations. What's the perspective from the European point of view in order, especially on the collaboration with Brazil? Please, Mr. Robinson.
Thanks. This is a great question to start with, but I think what I want to do is just to focus in on what we might mean by science diplomacy. So science diplomacy, the term, originates only about 20 years ago in the dying days of the Clinton administration in the State Department in Washington, DC, and particularly took off under the Bush administration that followed. And there, in trying to reorientate towards a way of fighting the then war on terror that didn't involve fighting with guns, the State Department saw that science might be a way to foster communication when all other channels had failed. And over time, this developed into a research center and collaboration and resulted in a report published by the AAAS, sponsored by the State Department, and the Royal Society in London on science diplomacy in 2009. And since then, I include myself and others who've become scholars of science diplomacy, have started to look into various aspects of the claims made in that report. So there are two claims that I think are important here to understand so that we can answer this question. Firstly, the report claimed there are three kinds of science diplomacy, a typology that defined that there was science for diplomacy, in which case scientific results and knowledge could be used by diplomats to further diplomatic endeavors, that there was science in diplomacy, in which case scientific data could be used in science diplomacy. And then there was diplomacy for science that might mean things like the International Council of Scientific Unions, or it might be standards. And these things are standard across all forms of diplomacy. They don't just apply for science. But the thing that was interesting in that report, more pressingly, was this idea there was a historical thing called science diplomacy. The science diplomacy had been going on for centuries. Now, we don't really have a figure on how far back this idea of science diplomacy goes, but certainly we can say that Benjamin Franklin was an active science diplomat in his day. We could point to the Royal Society of London, who appointed a foreign secretary responsible for foreign members of that scientific academy 20 years or so before the British state appointed a minister for foreign affairs. So there's some claim, highly dubious, that science diplomacy might be an earlier form of diplomacy. That's clearly rubbish, because we know that medieval kingdoms had a diplomatic corps of sorts. But what we can say is that science and diplomacy have had a long and integrated and interconnected history. The best example that I have between Europe and Brazil is a historical one. I'm a historian, and therefore that's where I always start from with my studies. And so the example I'd like to share is that Brazil, in terms of doing deep sea ocean science, that is more than just fisheries, really started after the Second World War. And the first three directors happened to be refugees from Europe. Vladimir Besnard fled the Soviet Revolution in 1917, and his family moved to Paris before coming to Brazil. Ingvar Milesson, an Icelandic gentleman, fled the US-UK occupation of Iceland during the Second World War. And Marta Vanucci, whose family fled Mussolini's government in the 1920s, came to Brazil. And these three figures, all European, directed Brazilian ocean science in a direct relationship with Europe. Never better shown than when the Brazilian Research Institute purchased its first deep sea research vessel in 1966 from Norway, a historical centre, superpower even in ocean science. And they purchased this vessel. Ingvar was very active in negotiating the purchase. And when the Brazilians went to Norway to pick up the vessel from Bergen, they threw a big party along with the local Norwegian scientists, who realised that the vessel was going to sail rather empty in terms of scientific instruments. And the Geophysical Institute in Bergen emptied its storerooms to fill out the ship. And then an expedition they called the Viking Indio expedition sailed the vessel back to Brazil with the Brazilian Navy, Brazilian ocean scientists, and Norwegian scientists on board, whilst the Norwegian ocean scientists taught the Brazilians how to use all of the equipment. And that's an example of a NATO country supporting a non-NATO country to foster greater capacity in ocean science in the Southern Atlantic.
Thank you very much. I would like to ask the same question to our second guest, to Mr. Andrei Polejack, of course, on the Brazilian point of view. So how science diplomacy or ocean science diplomacy can foster international relations on a Brazilian perspective. Please, Mr. Polejack.
Thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting that Sam just presented some of the historical background, especially with regard to the Oceanographic Institute at the University of São Paulo, USP, which was one of the first Brazilian institutes dealing with oceanology and oceanography. But up today, I'd like to bring some highlights from modern times, and they are very interesting to be dealt with. Since 2013, the North Atlantic decided to organize itself for a big alliance on research, on ocean research, because it became clear to the US, Canada, and the European Union there was no way that they could develop the research needed to understand the North Atlantic without an alliance and bridging up their research capacities, but also funding and mobilizing their research communities. And that was business as usual, as you always see. So the superpowers in ocean research just aligned their research capacities to unveil the unknowns of one of the basins that is most studied, which is the northern part of the Atlantic. But then similar negotiations started happening with Brazil and South Africa through the European Union. So we had signed bilateral agreements that were devoted to foster marine research cooperation and innovation as well. And because of that, Brazil and South Africa started learning how was the process of building up such an alliance for the North, and saw the benefit that would accrue from us doing the same down in the South, where the research gaps are so huge that we basically know almost nothing about the seabed or the resources therein. So because of that, Brazil and South Africa decided then to hold hands and progress in defining scientific agenda for the South, with the participation of Argentina and Uruguay from our side, but also Namibia and Angola from the African side. And that was particularly interesting because the research priorities that were defined together between the main stakeholders, which are government, research community, but also private sector and NGOs, the research priorities were very similar to the North Atlantic, which meant that in spite of research capacities, human capacities in ocean sciences, the knowledge gaps were similar and they need to be tackled in somehow. So that was stepwise process to then achieve to an all-Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance that was defined through the signing of the Blam Statement between the EU, Brazil, and South Africa, but also with the participation of the US, Canada, Angola, Namibia, and Argentina and Cape Verde now. So all those countries are somehow connected and trying to align their research. And in that process, in that particular process, the term science diplomacy was used quite often. And when you check on back a little more, the former Committee Commissioner for Research and Innovation in the European Commission, Carlo, he kept using the term science diplomacy as a way of progressing European values abroad and also to help leverage research capacities worldwide. And I was very keen in understanding what exactly was that, what was the meaning of that. And today I'm developing a research to try to understand that. And I am coming to a conclusion that, in fact, efforts such as the All-Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance is a beautiful example of science diplomacy happening in the ocean. And when you look back, as Sam loves to do, the whole process of negotiating the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is like the global constitution for the ocean, was pretty much based on scientific evidence that is important up to now to define maritime boundaries, to even settle disputes between countries in marine affairs. So with that regard, it is quite an intrinsic part of doing ocean affairs or ocean negotiations today in the world that we use scientific evidence at some point. And thus, science diplomacy becomes a major process that drives that negotiation. So I guess that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And please follow the sponsor of this initiative on Twitter at ConfapBR and at ENRICH_Brazil. And follow the sponsor of this initiative on Facebook at ConfapBR and ENRICH in Brazil altogether. So I would like to continue with Mr. Polejack for the second question. So how can research can be promoted by science diplomacy, of course, focusing on ocean science diplomacy, perspective on Brazilian point of view on this promotion of ocean science diplomacy?
Well, there are several ways in that to happen. I can name a few. So if you take at the UN level, the UN has been discussing for the past 15 years, sort of, how to regulate the access and the benefit sharing coming from the use of the biodiversity that is beyond the jurisdiction of the country. So that means that up to now, it's a first come, first served basis. So if you have the technology, if you have the vessels, you might as well just go in the middle of nowhere, no man's land, and just, explore the resources. But now they're discussing on a new implementation agreement that will be legally binding to the countries that shall adopt it. And that means that we need to understand what are we talking about? What kind of resources are we talking about? How's biodiversity behaving in overseas, in areas that are not under any country's jurisdiction, and what are the technologies available today that will bring up new revenues and profits for companies and industry that we could be leveraging from, and how to share that kind of benefit. So that's how diplomacy will foster, for one example, research and scientific developments around the globe. A second one, which is coming also from the example that I just provided for the All-Atlantic Ocean Research Alliance, was that the European Union decided to support research projects through their funding program, the Horizon 2020. And Brazil was not eligible for accessing those funds since the start of Horizon 2020. But because of the alliance, there was an exception made for Brazil. So there are now ongoing projects funded by the Commission. They are trying to address all the deliverables that we had set up for the Belém Statement that created the alliance. So again, it was a diplomatic movement that actually brought back to Brazil investments and funds and opportunities for our research community to further access the state-of-the-art science that is being dealt with in the Atlantic. Another example of diplomacy being very useful in the research context is Brazil has been developing now a new concept of innovation diplomacy that seeks to go further research itself, but try to address prototyping, innovation in a sense of developing product, right? So Brazil is organizing a network of all the science attaches that are present in our multiple embassies and trying to do what other countries do, such as the UK, Sam might know this better than me, through their research councils and British Council, in which they promote their research projects and opportunities in their own university, attracting more people and using that kind of information innovation and benefit as a force or a soft power, what an author, an academic likes to say. It's a different type of power. It's not based on coercion, but it's based on attraction and seduction at some point. In that regard, it is very interesting to see the results coming out of those kind of linkages and bridging countries. So diplomacy is using science to bridge those dialogues and have their own values, national values and interests being dealt with and defended abroad. So it is very interesting to see how this interplay comes to an end, like in processes at the UN level, in which different countries form different blocs to negotiate issues that are globally important. It ends up that research that are done in cooperative mode can have better results in the negotiation process at the diplomatic level. So I hope that I was kind of clear, but there are many things going on right now in the field. And science diplomacy, especially in the ocean, is something very, very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Polejack, 100% clear. So I would like to ask the same question. Of course, that's this time on a European point of view to Mr. Sam Robinson. So Robinson, how research can be promoted by ocean science diplomacy in a European perspective? Please, Mr. Robinson.
Thanks. Rather than speaking from a European perspective, I think I'm going to pick up on what Andrei was saying about the global perspective. And why I'm going to go with that line is we globally, as scientists or just merely as humans, stand at the precipice of some major environmental challenges, be it global climate change or rising sea level or global warming, which all are one and in and of the same. And I say that as we just come out of the hottest November on record, I think. And under that, the UN has some science diplomacy objectives, such as the Sustainable Development Goals for 2030, which include some specifically on the oceans, but others that kind of meet the oceans and the land. And the European Union, under its Green Deal and its new blue economy targets, combines together to try and form a way of meeting science with the needs of industry or the economy to form more sustainable ways of doing things at sea. And that is because the European Union meets the world on the ocean. So capacity building is important, not just scientific capacity building, but also diplomatic capacity building. The research that is done can be as expanded in capacity as you want, but we have to be realistic that the research that we are doing is feeding into models that, in order to create action to reverse the things that scientists tell us are going to happen to the environment, require diplomatic action. And that is where I think it's fair to say that in the next decade, the next 50 years, or the next century, science and science diplomacy can never be disentwined with one another. And to pick up on some of the kind of issues that I think you can see in the waters between Brazil and the European Union, we can see, as Andrei said, that there is a great capacity gap in our scientific understanding of that ocean. Well, why does that matter? If you know about the North Atlantic, why does the Southern Atlantic matter? Well, it matters because we have to understand the global picture, a synoptic view of all of our oceans, a one-shot ocean health, you might say, so that we can feed into accurate models of how climate is changing. On a more specific matter of resources, particularly what you may hear a lot more about, biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, which basically means biodiversity beyond the things that were encapsulated within territories under the UN Third Law of the Sea, which went during the 1970s extensively. We can see that there's overfishing going on in the Southern Ocean. That fishing is not being conducted necessarily by the nations that border the Southern Ocean. You see fishing vessels moving in from all over the world, and that's a science diplomacy issue as much as it's a scientific issue, because once those fish populations are gone, they're gone forever. But it intersects with other diplomatic issues. There are, and we know, I'm bringing this in from the research of the New York Times journalist Ian Urbana, who has written an excellent book that everyone should read on the outlaw ocean. And he points out that there is a link between overfishing issues and the need to police fisheries with other maritime issues, such as abuses of maritime labor law, modern slavery on some of these fishing vessels. And so it's important also, Andrei pointed out, the idea that national research funds are used and directed towards collaborative projects. It is not the case that the European Union alone, nor Britain, as Andrei picked out with its links with Brazilian research councils, can fix problems on a global ocean. It requires all of the nations of the world and all of their research councils to be prepared to pool money, which we realize is a precious resource, but the global ocean is 71% of the planet, and it itself is a precious space for humanity, whether we realize it on a day-to-day basis or not, to come together and to face head-on some of the challenges and to put in place solutions. And I hope that the UN Decade of the Ocean that will start in January of 2021 will be a key driver towards that goal.
Thank you very much, Mr. Robinson. I will have several questions actually to ask you, but I think our time is over. Unfortunately, our podcast, a limited duration, so unfortunately, we have to end our record. I'd like to thank you very much to Mr. Sam Robinson and Mr. Andrei Polejack for being with us. And remembering, Mr. Sam Robinson is case study editor on the Insight project, teaching associate Department of History and Philosophy of Science, University of Cambridge. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you very much also to Mr. Andrei Polejack, Senior Advisor of Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation of Brazil, PhD candidate of Maritime University in Sweden. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Always a pleasure. Whenever people need to contact us, just please do.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you also our sponsors who all of the realization of this podcast. First of all, the European Union delegation in Brazil, but also Confap, CNI, Unicamp, and all our sponsors. Thank you very much for having allowed the realization of this series of podcasts. This is the podcast number 12. It's the last for this one, but of course, we will come back next year. And I would like you to thank you for being with us. You are listening us on your device. You can find us on Spotify. It's very easy, just writing in ENRICH, and you can find the whole series of our podcast. So thank you for all of you, and see you on our next podcast next year. Thank you very much. See you soon.